these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's topic is some of the unrest and riots that we've seen across America for the last few months. If you listen to one side, you suggest that it's few and far between. If you listen to the other side, people might suggest that it's constant and in your face. And my personal take on it is it's a little bit of both. But it helps us if we actually had somebody who maybe roved around the country for a couple months, interviewing people, looking at the damage, and assessing in a systematic way, in an objective way, what's actually happened across America. So I have with me Michael Tracey. Michael, thanks so much for being on the show.
Happy to do it. It's a new experience to be interviewed by an elected official, like I mentioned, but we'll see where the chips fall.
Yeah. Let's see how it goes. So, Michael, you describe yourself as a roving journalist. Your work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Vice, numerous other places. So people can follow you. Your Twitter handles at mtracey, Tracey. And again, you came across my radar because of an article you wrote. Was it the New York Post? Is that or where did it show up?
This article was actually self-published. This was a Medium post that I did just to sort of collate a number of observations I had gathered from over the course of that 2-month trip. But I've written about aspects of the riots / protests for a bunch of publications. But I think what you're referencing here happens to be a self-published Medium post. Yeah,
and from what I can tell, you're not a Republican. Or
I am not. That's right.
Yeah. So again, it's important for the audience to know. So you're just reporting on what you're seeing here, and so over the course of a couple months, what cities did you visit, and what kind of were you gathering data as a result of this, or was it more anecdotal? Was it what did you find?
Well, I'm not collecting statistically representative data. I mean, that's sort of not the purpose of in-person, firsthand journalism. But I think in a way you could call it experiential or anecdotal data. So where I happen to visit and the people I happen to speak to, I'm not going to then extrapolate as perfectly representative of the entire electorate or anything, but it's at least a representative enough sample in my mind that I can make roughly approximate inferences as to how certain people in certain areas reacted to the events of the past few months. I mean, I set out to initially go primarily to Chicago and Minneapolis. Minneapolis being where the riots / protests in late May really kicked off, as we can recall. But I extended the trip to go to Seattle, Portland. Portland is kind of its own animal. I went to Philadelphia, the Bronx, and even smaller places, as I mentioned in that post, where you would almost never expect rioting to occur. I mean, when I mentioned that rioting took place in a few of these smaller or mid-sized cities, most people have no idea. And a few examples would be Fort Wayne, Indiana, Olympia, Washington, Atlantic City, New Jersey, Green Bay, Wisconsin. I mean, unless you were specifically looking for information from those cities, you would never know that any kind of rioting took place. But I can recall, just for example, there was one shopkeeper that I talked to in Green Bay. This woman who runs this family-owned, tobacco / kind of magazine type shop, said that they had never experienced anything like it in their entire existence as a family-run franchise going back decades. And So that's why, to me, the enormity of the writing seemed like it's been still, even now, underappreciated, just given the geographic distribution of it, where it wasn't just Chicago or Minneapolis or New York or Los Angeles, where some of the more high-profile writing did take place, but we even saw it extend into less expected locales, and that was almost the most interesting part to me. I mean, I would be on my route. I didn't fully sort of delineate a route when I set off. It was just sort of ad hoc, but almost anywhere I just sort of Googled on the way, there happened to be riots that took place in, again, a lot of these more far-flung places that you wouldn't have anticipated. So that's why it seemed like there was something sociologically or politically novel about these riots that, to me, didn't seem like it had been really conveyed, and that was and there seemed like almost a journalistic void there, which is a big reason why I spent the time I did traveling.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. There's certainly a void, again, which is kind of why you came across our radar. There's certain journalists that are constantly, whether it's filming or reporting on certain locations. Andy No comes to mind, obviously, but he's usually in Portland. Occasionally reporting on other places, but and he stays pretty specifically to Antifa. But overall, there's a huge void in journalism on this. Was there since you went to so many places that seem very different, small, large, widespread across the country, was there a specific thread or a common thread between all of these that might cause, and especially cause some of these demonstrations to turn violent and destructive?
Well, one through line that I think I could discern, and that you see replicated in city after city, has to do with a distinction that I draw in that particular Medium post, and that I've talked about elsewhere, between what I would call ideological rioting and then looting. A lot of people just tend to think of all chaos that happens in a riotous context as the same. But there are distinctions to be made. And the ideological rioting, to me, is the most interesting, because there are certain actors who have an explicit ideological motive who tend to instigate the rioting climate, right? And then once you have municipal resources consumed, where they're dealing with arson or they're dealing with protests that spiral out of control, then what you happen in a place like Chicago, for example, where I spent a lot of time on the south and west sides, which are heavily black, you hear from just local residents that the police almost stood down. And once that happens, a situation is created where the more opportunistic, non-ideological looting can take place, right? Where there's no police in the vicinity, and if you're a teenager and all your friends are rushing into an apparel store or something, then what the heck? You just join in, right? But I think that ought to be distinguished between whatever precipitated the riotous atmosphere in the first place, which often, to me, at least, and especially in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where it all really started, had an explicit ideological motive. But I think, in the flurry of rioting activity, often those different elements can get conflated. But assuming there was an ideological motive, not assuming, there was. I mean, I heard it and saw it. An ideological motive that was driving the instigators of the rioting. That, to me, needs to be focused upon in terms of getting the best possible sense of why what happened. I mean, looting could take place at any time, theoretically, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But it needs a cover. It needs a situational cover, which is given by the ideological rioting that you mentioned, and it's further exacerbated by the fact that mayors are often ordering their police force to simply stand down, and and I guess the obvious consequence is opportunistic looting. And I do agree. I think the more interesting discussion is the ideological rioting that occurs. And I know you didn't do a statistical analysis of this, but one study recently did. So 93% of BLM protests have been peaceful. But that being said, even though 7% are not peaceful, that's still 540 different instances that have been violent, like actively violent, targeting individuals, property, businesses. And I have to question even that. Does that include, the videos we see in DC, where you've got a mob of people? They might not be violently assaulting the people eating there at the restaurant, but it's hard to argue that they're not clearly infringing upon those people's rights as they stand over them screaming and telling them to raise their fist. I would love to see a breakdown of that analysis, and if instances like those are included, because I think it would be much, much higher. But in any case, even if it's just 540, that's a huge number. And I got to wonder too, like, how does that even compare to the late 60s, when the last time America experienced something like this?
That also gets into philosophical questions about what constitutes violence, right? I mean, I often hear people denying that setting fire to a block of small businesses is even per se violent, because if there doesn't happen to be anyone inside the businesses, then the only damage done was to property, and people don't consider that violence. Right. Or at least some do not. But I think if you're living in the neighborhood, and this was relayed to me often by the people who were actually there, meaning non-activists, just ordinary people going about their lives, or at least attempting to, if the main street down the road where you go and get your groceries or your prescriptions or your appliances or whatnot, if that's all up in flames, yeah, maybe your physical person wasn't threatened in that immediate moment, but I don't know, violence sounds at least in the ballpark as to how you would perceive that. But yeah, I mean, I saw that study you mentioned floating around, but I don't quite know about the methodology of it necessarily, which is why I thought, which is part of my impetus for going around and looking at myself, because then I can at least have some firsthand experience to gauge based on, without relying on these potentially dubious studies, But yeah.
And I think in this study they include property damage, so they are including that. But again, it's the other question is, are you actively infringing on somebody's rights? And I think getting into somebody's personal space is an active infringement on their liberty. Most people would agree with that. I mean, harassing somebody is against the law, and yet that seems to be happening, constantly. Again, we'd have to ask the authors of that study, I think. But let's get back to the ideological rioting and what's causing it. I mean, there's two basic groups that are at the forefront of the conversation: Black Lives Matter and Antifa. So, I mean, how did you see these? How did you see these evolve throughout your travels? What do you make of it now? Is Antifa as widespread as BLM? I would say I doubt it. It seems to be mostly concentrated in certain cities. But what's your observation?
Well, first, I mean, I think it's fair to say that these groupings are fairly nebulous, meaning you're generally not going to find, in the case of, for one, BLM, a organized command structure, right? I mean, this is, especially with social media playing such an outsized role, anybody can theoretically participate and appropriate the mantle of BLM.
Sure. It's almost like a franchise at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why a huge portion of the BLM protest activity has been white. I mean, it's a little awkward to say, but to me, there's no doubt, based on what I observed, that BLM does happen to be a largely white movement. I know that might sound incongruous, but it just is. I mean, I was in Chicago on Juneteenth, a African American holiday, which I think rightly got more notoriety this year. I mean, I don't see any reason why not to commemorate the liberation of slaves. But there was a big march held in Chicago on Juneteenth where I would say maybe 95% of the participants were white. Actually, the police force that was dispatched to monitor this protest was more racially diverse than the protest.
And how often did these black police officers get yelled at by white people?
I've seen that at various times. Definitely, I don't recall if it happened to occur at that particular protest. But yeah, I mean, one thing that definitely gets lost in a lot of the discussion around policing is that over the past, I don't know, 20 years, maybe a little more, there really has been a conscious, active attempt by especially urban police departments to diversify their ranks. And whether the protesters are aware of that seems a little dicey. But nonetheless, I mean, they attribute anyone who's complicit in or is a functionary of the criminal justice system as a participant in a system that is fundamentally white supremacist and racist. So you can be, hypothetically a black or non-white person and still be perpetuating what they regard as a white supremacist system.
Right. So how do they explain that? I mean, when you talk to these people, how do they explain that contradiction?
Well, I mean, I think they would say that over the course of centuries, there have at times been non-whites who are held out as the symbols to kind of put forward this notion of faux diversity on the part of a white supremacist power structure, which wants to make itself out to be more amenable to minorities than it actually is. I mean, that's a version of what they would say. But that's why they say. That's why they say. That's why one of the chants that's become so ubiquitous at these protests is ACAB. All cops are bastards. Not some cops, not white cops. All cops, because the system is fundamentally depraved in their minds, and is not even susceptible to reform. So that's why when I almost chuckle when I see a lot of these municipal officials offer reforms around the margins, or they'll say they'll cut the police budgets by X%, or they'll institute some kind of training program or whatnot. I mean, it's a big protest movement, and you can't necessarily generalize about everybody who's engaged with it necessarily. But in terms of the beating activist heart of the protest movement, I mean, they're not going to be mollified by any of these incremental reforms. That's not why they're out there. They reject the system as such.
Yeah, it's totally revolutionary and in its nature. Although it's a little unclear, like what would make them stop protesting. And I often point this out, like the mark of I think a rational protest would be, if you do this, we will stop protesting. But they offer no such standards, and I find that to be pretty problematic. Because at the most extreme end, defund the police. Well, plenty of cities have done that at this point, and it hasn't mollified the protests at all. Portland being a pretty good example, but many other cities as well. They haven't abolished the police,
right? They might have cut some funding, but they haven't abolished, and
it's got to be abolished.
That's right. I can't. Again, if you look at what the overt insurrectionary anarchist portion, which are most closely associated with Antifa, advocate, when they say defund the police, they're not saying, cut $1 million and divert it to some kind of social program. They're saying that the police are fundamentally the functionaries of a system that is irredeemably rooted in white supremacy. So all cops are bastards is the slogan for a reason. You can't dress up a system that they view that way with, racially diverse front people. It will never satisfy them. But in fairness, I mean, it's often the case with such widely dispersed, diffused protest movements that you can't necessarily pin down one tangible goal. I mean, like, what was the one policy goal of the Tea Party? Because could you offer one thing that it would necessarily have placated them? So maybe that's just fundamental to large protest movements. You could? What would it have been? They would have gone home if something was done?
Yeah, but I think their basic movement started simply because of financial or fiscal responsibility, right? In reaction to bailing out the banks and all of this. So I do think it was a little bit more coherent, and also being founded in conservative principles. There's a limiting principle to that. Conservatism lives within a box. That's sort of the nature of conservatism. We're very concerned on the limiting principles by which we govern. And so, at its most extreme, it means government does a lot less than it does now, and is placated as such. But I find it with these particular movements, because and BLM is, it's the co-founder of BLM says it's a Marxist movement. And so there does appear to, that ideological structure does appear to be there, even though, your ground troops might not understand Marxism or what it really entails. But it's kind of revolution for the sake of revolution, which has by nature has no limiting principles, which is I think why we see what we see. Like, it's the goalpost can constantly be moved.
I think there's something to that. I think maybe the Tea Party is not a perfect analogy, but at least in my experience, there's an element.
Well, no,
of
not at all. I mean, they weren't violent.
I'm saying but I meant just in terms of the diffusion of the movement and whether the demands could be ameliorated by tangible policy offerings, right? But I think but for most protest movements, this is probably more so on the left than the right, but you could probably find commonality in at least a sense. Protests tend to be self-actualizing. Or the purpose of the protest is to protest. You derive some value from the act of doing it, from whatever kind of collective validation you get by being there, by being part of a movement. There's almost like a spiritual yearning that people satisfy by engaging in these kinds of protests, which sort of gets to the secularization of society, whether that's a healthy dynamic or not. But actually,
I agree with all that.
Now that the bringing up the Tea Party, which I did just offhandedly, brings to mind a question that I would just pose to you. I'm just sort of curious if, looking back on the legacy of the Tea Party and how the demands were about excessive government spending and debt and deficit. I mean, do you think whatever sentiment the Tea Party embodied back then, in the first term of the Obama administration, do you think that's really been represented under the Trump administration? I mean, I see statistics pretty often about spending going through the roof, and deficits and debt don't seem to be as of concern anymore. I mean, so how do you reconcile that?
Well, I would say if you were to poll the vast majority of members of Congress in the Republican Party, they would still prioritize deficits and debt quite a bit. It is true that this has not been a priority of the Trump administration. I think people give the current excesses in debt a lot more leeway, simply because there's a pandemic and there was an basically unanimous understanding that extreme measures had to be taken.
But even before the pandemic, this was the trend line, right?
Yeah, of course it was. But to say that there was no concerns amongst the base wouldn't necessarily be accurate either. The Tea Party was born out of a reaction to bailing out of the big banks. So it's simultaneously a concern with the debt, I think. And granted, I was on deployments during most of this time. I was not active in politics. Right. So So my knowledge of I was not on the ground with this movement, but I do see them now. I mean, there's Tea Party groups all over the U.S. I go and speak to them, and what they've basically morphed into is just a very conservative group. And so it's not just the debt; it's conservative principles as a whole. So I think all of the energy originally came from the bank bailouts. I don't think that. I know that. I mean, this is what's basically documented, and also a reaction to Obamacare. It would seem as well. Government takeover of more and more of your life, and so in many respects, aside from this one, the Trump administration has governed very conservatively, and so yeah, it does mollify the tensions and of the Tea Party activists quite a bit. And so I would say that's how I would explain it.
Yeah, that was just a little bit of a tangent for my own personal.
No, yeah, no, we're always hit with that as conservatives. But I just kind of say, well, yeah, neither party has managed to rein in the debt, but only one party actually at least talks about it. Managing to rein it in is a whole different question, because the American people themselves have to want to rein it in. And for the American people themselves to want to rein it in, we have to make reforms to the drivers of the debt, which is, entitlement spending. It's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and interest on the debt. This is mathematically true.
And entitlement reform was pretty much stricken from at least the administration's priority list from the outset. I mean, Trump campaigned on preserving Social Security and Medicare. And
right, he did. This is something I disagree with him on. But it's also, I understand why he's doing it, because the reality is as soon as we try to have a reasonable conversation about Social Security and Medicare and saving these programs, we're accused of throwing granny off a cliff. I mean, even Trump talking about the payroll tax holiday, which you still have to pay the taxes, by the way. So it's a very limited move, fiscally speaking, and even from the standpoint of actual fiscal stimulus, it's a very limited move. But what was the talking point on the left? He's trying to take away your Social Security. So we can't have an honest conversation about it in this country, because listen, if rational people just looked at the math on Social Security, you'd basically say, okay, if you're about my age, a millennial, we've got to retire later. Okay. Social Security I know we're getting down a tangent now on Social Security, but clearly this is important to me because I'm a millennial.
Of a podcast, right? You can go on tangents if you want.
Yeah, but there's ways to save it for our seniors, but also make it fiscally sustainable. But the Democrats do not let me have that conversation. They do not at all. I've seen it in hearings when we're in a budget committee. We're talking about the drivers of the debt, and I will ask our witnesses questions on, okay, like what are some of the options? Is it means testing Social Security? And the answer is, I think it is. Is it raising the retirement age for somebody who's 36, my age, because I'm going to live to an average of 78 years old. When Social Security was implemented, I believe the lifespan was in the late 60s. And they're like, yeah. And as soon as I'm done with my time, the next Democrat will say, I think my colleague just said he wants to cut Social Security for seniors. And it's like, we're not having an honest conversation up here. And it's very frustrating. And that trickles down. So the American people can't hear it, is the point, because it is a complex discussion, and the rhetoric gets dishonest and overheated. And this is I'm not trying to defend Trump on this because I disagree with him, but it's also this is why he's refused to touch it, because the American people themselves are not ready for it.
Well, in 2016, neither were Republican primary voters, evidently. I mean, that was sort of why 2016 seemed like a sort of a watershed year ideologically. Where a lot
that's why I said the American people and not Democrats or Republicans. It's everybody. And so leaders have to get together and have a very honest conversation about it. Otherwise it's not going to get fixed. And so, these policy issues are downstream of the cultural issues, and the culture is of, I still want my check from the government on this, because I was told that it was going to be promised to me. And so that remains true, and that's not changing. But back to rioting.
Yes.
So, I forgot the question I was going to ask because
my impression was that the rioters were not inordinately fixated on Social Security benefits.
No, this is not what they're upset about at all.
A little bit of a generational gap there.
Yeah. But I do kind of want to key in on, so, Antifa does seem like a more nebulous movement. Like, I'm not sure if there's an Antifa website, for instance, but there's clearly a BLM website that lays out clear positions, which do seem to me to be based in Marxism as per their co-founders' ideology. The most prominent of which is, getting rid of the Western idea of a nuclear family. And you show this to somebody in the Black community and they're like, well, what are you talking about? Why would my family is everything to me? Why would I be supportive of this? So there's some inconsistencies there. I mean, and so when you talk to people, what are they do they connect their particular protest, and let's say the peaceful ones, with the organization Black Lives Matter that's fundraising millions upon millions of dollars through Act Blue, and are they connecting these and has a Marxist ideology associated with it? Is there a connection there? And like, what do people say about it?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people cite these sort of mission statement on the official BLM website where they talk about dismantling patriarchal norms and so forth. But I mean, I think why Black Lives Matter became so popular and prominent is because it could be all things to all people. I mean, the simple statement "Black Lives Matter" is uncontroversial, of course, right? But then it becomes very much entangled with a more wholesale ideological vision. But for instance, the corporations that put out Instagram posts and tweets celebrating Black Lives Matter, I don't necessarily think share the same vision of it as what you might call Marxist or heavily ideological elements, right? So it can also become almost a branding exercise. But the goal of this trip was to speak to people who had been most directly impacted by the fruits of the Black Lives Matter movement as they saw it, right? Or as they experienced it. And for the non-activists, for example, in North Minneapolis, which is a Black neighborhood, in theory, they might have some affinity with Black Lives Matter. I mean, you often hear from people saying, look, I'm a Black man in America. I know the deal. I mean, bad interactions with police over the years. And they have no reason to, lie about that. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that over the course of decades, often Black people do feel like they are unfairly targeted by police. But in terms of this protest movement, if your experience of it is that the aftermath resulted in the barbershop down the street being shuttered after it had just gotten ready to reopen due to COVID, then that had a detrimental material impact on your life that didn't seem like it had been acknowledged at all by much of the media coverage. So I mean, it's easy to affirm in theory that you have some vague agreement with Black Lives Matter, but it's a different thing than to sort of examine how specific individuals who aren't necessarily involved in the heated political debates experienced when their just ordinary lives were disrupted. Especially with the pandemic. I mean, the example that really stays with me, and I wrote a Wall Street Journal column on this in July, is this woman in Minneapolis who her name is Flora Westbrooks. She had to shut down due to COVID because she ran a hair salon, had for years and years since the late 80s. It enabled her to help her son go through law school, buy a house, and so on. And all of a sudden, one night, her hair salon is just burned down. And this woman's a Democrat. She told me that she voted for Joe Biden in the primaries. On principle, would support Black Lives Matter. Maybe not the Marxist, heavy-handed element of it, but just as sort of a general notion. But the impact on her life was pain and suffering. Was the demolition of her life's work. I mean, she was traumatized by it. And to me, it was almost viscerally offensive that her perspective and so many others, particularly in Minneapolis. I mean, I wish more people could have spent 2 weeks or so there like I did and just talk to, random people that you could just select anywhere on the street and just get their firsthand impressions of it, because it really did depart drastically from the predominant national media narratives. Now, I do think that there have been policy reforms that have stemmed from the protest movement that are definitely useful. I think Rand Paul introduced a bill to outlaw no-knock raids based on the incident involving Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And that to me is perfectly reasonable. But I don't know, the specific impact that it had on just regular folks in many cases was ignored by a media which just presumptively ascribed some inherent virtue to the movement and then shaped their coverage decisions accordingly. Like, why still at this point? It's been about 4 months now, I guess.
Yeah.
Why is there still not a definitive, big magazine article on the riots of 2020, or a 60-minute story where they go and visit some, like the Ethiopian immigrant, for example, that I spoke to, who had his car repair shop destroyed in Minneapolis.
Right.
It just hasn't happened. And you got to ask yourself why. I don't think a lot of these people who are directly impacted are necessarily going to therefore vote for Donald Trump. But it means that their experiences have been chronically underrepresented. And just as someone with a journalistic impulse, to me, leave the politics aside, that seems like malfeasance.
Yeah, you would think that you wouldn't be the only one looking into this. Because it really does take an institution like the New York Times with a lot more resources to systematically cover it, and there's effectively a refusal to do so. And the answer, I think, as to why is pretty obvious, that because it removes some of the credibility from these movements that they've hailed as the pinnacle of morality. But as a result, they've never been held accountable, and I think therefore gone way too far and continue to go too far. It doesn't show any signs of slowing. It would appear to me, and as we've talked about before, the goalposts always change. So again, there's never any standard by which America can meet that would meet their demands, and so there's always going to be a reason to riot under this current national sentiment, and that's a little bit scary. So, and as you said, it doesn't mean they're going to go out and vote for Donald Trump, but does it at least mean that they're advocating for change locally? I mean, because a lot of these policies or a lot of this rioting does seem to be connected with a rising crime certainly is connected with the bail reform, refusal to actually prosecute crime, refusal to actually hold a lot of these rioters accountable for the damage and destruction that's occurred. And then a rhetorical, or I say public statements that really fly in the face of reality. I mean, public statements that either apologize for it or explain it away or minimize it to an extent. That's got to be frustrating. People have to see that, I would think, or do they?
When you talk to regular people about politics, I don't know if this is your experience, but they're not immersed in the policy details by and large. Now, I'm not talking about people who come to political events and who are engaged. I'm talking about those who you would just randomly select when you happen upon the street, which is what I tended to do. I didn't want to talk to the activists necessarily. I wanted to talk to the people who are not going to be, fighting online about the latest controversy or what have you. And I don't know if it would occur to them to advocate for bail reform. But you can sort of identify maybe certain tendencies in how they discuss things that might be conducive to certain policy initiatives. Like one gaping hole in the national coverage was how positively the National Guard was viewed by these overwhelmingly non-white communities once they were finally deployed, often belatedly, meaning that they couldn't necessarily prevent any of the initial destruction. But it's not as though I don't think I encountered a single person who was offended by the presence of the National Guard in their neighborhoods.
Oh, that's interesting.
In fact, they welcomed it. So, I mean, can you extrapolate something in terms of what their opinions might be in terms of a broader criminal justice style issue or law and order? Possibly, but generally speaking, they're not going to frame it in terms of, oh, we need to roll back some of these bail reform laws or that kind of thing. It's just about there's their attitudes, and their attitudes, to me, at least what I saw and heard, was far more interested in just basic far more welcoming of just stabilizing forces that didn't compromise their livelihoods or their safety. And that's, it sounds commonsensical, but so often in terms of the media discussion, it's almost like a foreign concept.
Yeah. And I think that is true. And imagine that people want basic safety and order in their communities. The defund the police movement has very little support amongst the Black community. I've seen numbers as far as 80% wouldn't support it. It might be a little less than that, but it's an overwhelming majority, of course. People want better policing, of course, but they certainly don't want no policing or less of it. They just want it to be fair and just, which I think is a pretty reasonable expectation. Unfortunately, we're a bit out of time. Michael, anything to add on what you've discovered and maybe how do you see this playing out over the next couple of months? Do you see any signs of this subsiding, or will we continue to see what we're seeing?
Well, I mean, the apex of it definitely was that period in late May, early June that still, bizarrely to me, has been under analyzed in terms of what actually gave rise, specifically, logistically, to that simultaneous eruption of insurrectionary activity and destruction that was on a scale that is beyond anything we've seen in the United States since at least the 1960s. And the 1960s, when that parallel gets invoked, I sort of bristle, because most of what happened in the 1960s in terms of urban unrest were these, what you might call ghetto uprisings, or they were born of genuine immiseration within a lot of urban communities. And they were overwhelmingly Black, like the Watts riots or Newark, New Jersey riots, etc. But these, I mean, like in Minneapolis, you had white kids from the suburbs, or even white kids from out of state, all over the place, jetting into the Twin Cities area. And it resulted in just almost farcical scenarios, like a Somali grocery owner having to ward off white anarchist rioters who were trying to, burn down his establishment. I mean, so that to me, the parallel doesn't hold when you look at that with the 1960s. I don't think we see as much of that anymore. Although, I mean, there is still rioting that's obviously taking place. I mean, look at Kenosha.
Yeah, and a lot of traveling too from the outside. I mean, heard from a lot of people staying in hotels in DC this past week that there's a lot of people who are traveling in, checking into the hotel, and then going to riot. I mean, it's a crazy thing. And so, I wonder how this is funded. Is this funded through the donations that are going into the Black Lives Matter website?
I doubt it.
don't know.
I doubt. I mean, I don't know the specifics of every instance, right? But I doubt it's as centralized as sometimes the more paranoid elements of the right suppose. I mean, there could be some of that. Who knows? But I think largely it's organic, because there are people who genuinely, sincerely believe in the righteousness of their cause. So if it means they have to travel a little bit, they're willing to incur that expense. But if you're able to travel, that means you have to have some expendable income, right? So the idea that these are just sheer ghetto uprisings of the kind that occurred in the 60s just doesn't ring true to me.
Yeah.
In terms of what is going to happen in the future, I don't know. I mean, now it's going to be, I think, more and more intertwined with the election, maybe more explicitly. Clearly, a lot of the times that these are anti-Trump events, and we'll have to see. I mean, again, I think some people are a little too cavalier in just assuming that unrest necessarily redounds to the political benefit of Trump just because he tweets law and order in all caps frequently.
Mm-hmm.
I think people have a little bit more of complexity in how they process unrest in their communities. But we'll have to see. I'm gonna go out on the road again, probably in October, and I'll maybe give you an update.
That'd be great. No, Michael, thank you for your reporting, and thank you for being out there, and I appreciate you being on the show.
All right, thanks. I enjoyed it.